Hello students, this is Professor Pell at Wilbur Wright College, and today we're going to be talking about rhetorical appeals, modes, and strategies. So historically, rhetoric has been used to persuade audiences in speech and writing. It of course began with speeches back in the Greek and Roman times. Plato introduced the notion of rhetoric as ways to get your audience to be persuaded to believe what it is you're talking to them about. This is different than what we often hear in modern times in the media. We'll hear people use this term of rhetoric to mean pretentious talk or empty chatter with very little meaning, or sometimes a heightened skill at using language. It can be used as a derogatory term in the media often, but it can also be used in the media as a positive term. But it's generally not linked the same way that we'll be talking about rhetoric in analysis and also academia. So when you're thinking about rhetoric, there's all types of rhetoric that you can use to enhance your writing. But there's never a magic rhetoric that will make your piece of writing become so wonderful that your reader will automatically buy your argument. With that being said, though, if you employ rhetoric well, it can help you enhance your points and get your reader to be more engaged in what you're writing. So, why is that? Well, believe it or not, you and I have been trained from a very early age to already think in this rhetorical way. This is how we've learned, how we've reacted to people, and how we remember things is through rhetoric. We're sort of trained already since infancy in rhetoric. And I like to use this example of my daughter. So I have a young child. She's about 3, and she sometimes will say to me, "Mommy, I want a cookie right now." You know how children can be. They throw tantrums. And often I will look at her and I will say, "When you talk to me like that, are you going to get a cookie?" And she'll look at me and she'll think. And I'll say to her, "Let's try that again. And you think about what you want to get and ask me in a way that's more likely for me to give you what you want." And then she will think about it for a minute, and then she'll say, "Mama, can I please have a cookie?" And she changes her rhetoric. So in the beginning, she was very angry and demanding because she wanted that cookie and she wanted it now. But of course, I'm her audience, and I do not want to respond to somebody who talks like that. So she thought about it and rephrased it using a different rhetoric, a nicer rhetoric, one with please and a nicer tone of voice. That's all rhetorical, okay? How you say it, not what you say. So in this class, you're going to be using rhetoric to make your writing more effective, and this is very timely when you're thinking about your writing assignments for this course. You'll also use rhetoric in your college career to help your future writing more effective, and that's just not in your essays. That's also when you're writing to your instructors. If you need an extension on your deadline, or you need some letter of recommendation or something like that, it's how you write, not just what you say. And then outside of college, you'll be better able to evaluate the ways in which people are trying to persuade you, but also to persuade them yourself of the things that you want. And ultimately, rhetoric will help you enhance your critical thinking skills. When you're able to analyze the way that others are presenting their ideas and their arguments, being able to analyze that will help you enhance your own critical thinking skills, both in college and outside of college. Okay, so rhetorical appeals. These are what Plato set down as sort of the basis of rhetoric. The first rhetorical appeals, they directly correlate to the persuasive aspects of a text, okay? And what happens is various strategies or modes can support an appeal, but the appeals are the top of the iceberg. So the appeals directly affect an audience of a text by the way of their intellect, their emotions, and their thoughts. People respond in different ways because of the appeals. And the three types of appeals are logos, pathos, and ethos. So logos. Logos appeals to an audience's logic or pragmatism. Okay, think of this as the intellectual response, where the person presenting the text wants the viewer or the reader to think, use their logic and their reasoning to respond. So if it's a logos appeal, what you'll see will often be based in facts, statistics, and any other irrefutable evidence. Okay, because the writer wants you to think, oh yes, of course, there's no doubt this is true logically. When they use this irrefutable evidence, it helps to persuade you to say, oh, my emotions are not involved. This is absolutely true. There's nothing about this that is untrue. I must believe it. All the logic is in place. The next rhetorical appeal is pathos. Pathos appeals to your emotions, okay? Your emotions, and we see this all the time, right? If you've ever seen that commercial where it's for the ASPCA, and there's that really heart-wrenching music playing over the commercial, and you see the images of the sad pets that are locked up in their cages because they've been abandoned by their owners or whatever. That's appealing to pathos, your emotions. They're trying to get you to support the ASPCA or your local pound or whatever to through your emotions rather than through your logic. The emotional content of pathos is there to change the audience's emotional state, whether it's sadness or guilt or happiness, whatever the emotional state is. They want, with pathos, the writer or the speaker, whatever text you're looking at, is trying to get you to change your emotion to be able to buy whatever it is they're selling, so to speak, to believe what the text is saying, to follow that argument. So the text's aim with pathos is to make the viewer or the reader really feel something and to come to that side. And it doesn't always have to be one emotion. You just have to ask yourself, if you're trying to figure out if something is pathos, is this making me feel something? Has something changed in me when I've seen this, or read this, or watched this, whatever the context is? Now, ethos. Ethos is an appeal to an authority of another individual. So it uses the authority of an expert to influence the audience. So think about those times where they're citing an authority on something to get you to believe something. The aim with ethos is to have you side with the argument, because you, as the audience, will hopefully assume that this expert is correct. Okay, so that you're looking up to the expert, you're looking to the expert as a guide for your response to whatever text it is that you're looking at. Now, let's look at the rhetorical appeals logos, ethos, and pathos. Those are the pinnacles of persuasive speech. Now, there's also rhetorical styles, modes, and strategies that can help support those appeals. So the rhetorical appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos, they're at the top of this triangle, and they're often supported by the rhetorical modes and strategies. So then, what are the modes and strategies? Well, here are just some of them, and many of these will probably be familiar to you. Things like illustration, extended examples, narration, description, process, compare and contrast, analogy, cause and effect, classification and division, and definition. There are way more than this, but these are just some, and these are ones that you'll often see in writing, so I want to look at these specifically. So illustration. Illustration is simply when you make a point and then go on to support that point with concrete examples. Illustration, you may employ transitional phrases like for example or for instance to introduce the support for the point that you're making. Now, extended example is just like illustration, but sometimes an extended example will go on for much longer than just an illustrative paragraph. An extended example might be something that goes on for several paragraphs, and sometimes you might read an extended example that goes on for a whole chapter if you're reading a book. So think of extended example. Yeah, you're using that example to support your point. It's just more in depth than a simple illustration. Narrative. So a narrative tells a story as if it were, well, exactly that, a story. In general, it'll have sort of a beginning, middle, and end with certain characters. It'll have sort of a plot, essentially. And they're often in chronological order, but sometimes they might contain flashbacks or flash forwards or interruptions. And narratives will often show you that story arc to make you entertained. Narration is really an interesting and powerful rhetorical strategy or mode because people think in stories all the time. That's why books can be so powerful, and short stories and films and anything that you look at. We talk in narratives all the time. So narratives can be very powerful, and you can even at times use narrative even in formal writing situations to help support a point that you're making. And description. Description is when we use very vivid, concrete detail to help support what we're talking about. We'll use sensory details to bring the environment alive. So if you're viewing something that uses description, you'll see lots of specific things in it to make you pay attention and become wrapped in whatever it is that you're looking at. You might see things that correlate to other senses or hear things that correlate to your senses, like sight and sound and taste and touch and smell. Description is often interwoven with narration to really bring a piece of writing or a piece of film to life. Now, process, on the other hand, doesn't bring things to life in such a vivid way. Process is much more concrete. Process essentially talks about how something is done or accomplished, sort of a how-to, a step-by-step explanation of what to do or how to do it. Now then, there's compare and contrast. Comparing and contrasting shows, comparing shows how two or more things are similar, whereas contrast shows how two or more things are different or unlike. When you are comparing and contrasting, though, you want to make sure that you have some sort of point that you're making and to help give purpose to comparing and contrasting. you don't want to just say that two things are similar and different, because that's not really a point. Okay, when you're using your writing, you're always trying to show something with when you're using those rhetorical strategies and modes. And so if you compare and contrast two things, two or more things, you want to make sure that there's a reason behind that to prove a point that you're making. Analogy. Analogy draws comparisons between two things that at first seem like they have very little in common. Analogies are very powerful because they allow you to draw your reader into an idea that might be very complex or foreign at first. Because what you do is you relate it to something that they can understand, and your reader is then more able to follow along. So you might find something every day that you can explain in basic concepts, and then let your reader relate that to something else. For example, I often use the analogy of the quotation sandwich, right? Most students know what a sandwich is, right? It's something you pick up. It's got two pieces of bread and some good stuff in the middle, and you use it to eat, right? And so students understand that structure, that three-layered structure. So I use that as sort of to give them a guide, a visual guide, to help them understand how to introduce a quote, then give a quote, and then follow it up with an explanation. So sandwiches really have nothing to do with quoting, right? But when you make that analogy, it brings a picture to the mind of my students, and then suddenly they go, oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, I know what a sandwich is. Oh, okay, that totally makes sense, right? At first they seem like they have nothing in common, but when you link the abstract idea, something that's foreign, to something concrete and ordinary, then that brings it to life for your audience. Cause and effect. So cause and effect happens because you establish why something else happens and the result from it. Okay, so you're establishing why something happened and the result of that cause. So here's an example. Cassie was drunk when she got into the car, so she crashed into a light pole, right? So the cause here is that Cassie was drunk, and the effect was she got in a car accident. Okay, now you do have to be cautious with cause and effects, because oftentimes just because two things happen chronologically doesn't indicate that there's causality, that there's a reason behind just because there's an order of events. So, for example, you might say Cassie bought new socks, which made the washing machine break. Right? Just because Cassie washed the new socks in the washing machine does not mean that they were the cause of the washing machine breaking. Right? Just because there is chronology doesn't indicate causality. Another is classification and division. This is when you have a group of things and you break them into categories according to some guiding principle that you've defined yourself. This is important when you are giving your reader an information about categories or different things that you're talking about in your paper that they might not be familiar with. It will help your reader be able to see the nuances of some whole that he or she may not have been able to see before because they don't know all the specifics about that whole. So when you break it down into these categories and allow the reader to understand your guiding principles behind what you're talking about, the reader will then be able to see that big picture that you're talking about. And definition. Definition sometimes students think that if they're using, trying to define something in their paper, that it means that they're just going straight to the OED or Webster's Dictionary and just copying a term from it into their paper. And that's really not what it's about. When you are using definition in your paper, it's generally to bring a new perspective on a term or an idea so that the reader can understand how you're using that term and what you intend for the reader to understand from that term, and how possibly how the reader might look at that term differently than he or she might have before. So definition is not just giving a quote from the dictionary, it's bringing context and nuance and thoughtfulness to a term that the reader might not understand initially. Okay, so here is your quiz. Here are your questions, and you can pause this now to find your answers. Okay, well, thank you, students, for listening and watching this presentation on rhetorical appeals, modes, and strategies. Again, this is Professor Pell, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Have a great day.